The transmission did not sound like a distress call. That was the first thing that made me stop. We were working the grave orbit around Vela's lantern, an old relay station that had torn itself apart sometime before my grandparents were born. Its broken ring still circled the dwarf star in a slow halo of scrap, paneling, docking bones, coolant tanks, fractured antenna spines, all the usual remains of something once important enough to be named and then important enough to be forgotten. The needle's luck drifted through it at less than a quarter thrust because her port stabilizer had been making an ugly whining noise since dawn, and Joran had threatened to throw me out an airlock if I pushed her harder. "We're here for salvage," he had reminded me 3 times already that day. "Not heroics, not mysteries, not one of your feelings." Joran always said "your feelings" like they were a mechanical defect. I might have agreed with him if the receiver hadn't chimed. It was a soft tone. So old our system almost failed to recognize it as a live source at all. I straightened in the pilot's chair and looked at the band readout. "Leo," I said, "tell me I'm reading that wrong." Leo floated forward from the navigation console, one hand still wrapped around a half-eaten ration strip. He leaned over my shoulder, scanning the frequency marker, then the source spread, then the age estimate that kept blinking uncertainly in the corner like the computer didn't trust itself. He stopped chewing. "That," he said slowly, "is diplomatic." Joran's voice came through from the engine trench behind the cockpit. "If either of you says the word interesting, I'm cutting life support." I did not answer him. I opened the channel manually. A voice filled the bridge. Not static. Not fractured code. A voice. Human. Clear enough that I forgot to breathe for the first few seconds. "This is the sole union of Earth," it said. Calm. Formal. Measured by someone who had expected to be heard by strangers and wanted to sound worthy of the moment. "We greet any listening civilization in peace. We request recognition, exchange, and open contact. Our coordinates are attached. We are ready to be known." The message ended. Then began again. Leo lowered himself slowly into the co-pilot chair without taking his eyes off the speaker grill. Behind us the engine hatch clanged open. Joran emerged, greased to both elbows, dark braid half fallen out of its tie, expression already irritated from being forced into a reality he had not approved. "What?" he said. "Did I tell you about mysteries?" I pointed at the receiver. The message played a second time. Joran listened all the way through, then looked at the source coordinates, then at me. "No," he said. "That's not a real answer. It's the correct answer." I was already turning the needle's luck toward the source. The object was wedged between the splintered remains of a docking spar and a drift of frozen plating, tumbling slowly in a pocket of black shadow. Our forward lights hit it piece by piece. First a scarred curve of alloy, then a cracked guidance fin, then a cylindrical body about 3 meters long wrapped in heat-scored shell plating the color of old bone. A diplomatic buoy. Ancient model. Older than anything with live registry still had a right to be. The recovery arm took 2 attempts because the buoy's spin was uneven and the luck hated delicate work. When the clamp finally caught, the whole ship shuddered in protest like she resented being used for archaeology. We hauled the buoy into cargo too. I was the first through the hatch. It rested in the middle of the hold on its bent stabilizer ring, scarred by centuries of micrometeor impacts, but still stubbornly intact. One side bore a sunburst crest I didn't recognize at first. The metal beneath it had dulled with time, but not enough to hide the words etched below in 3 languages, one of them Old Earth Standard. Seoul Union Diplomatic Mission. Leo let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Stars," he said. "It's real." Joran came in behind us, slower than usual. He circled the buoy once, reading the markings, studying the old panel seams, the nearly dead indicator lights that still pulsed every time the message loop reset. "Power cell?" he asked. I checked the side display with my wrist scanner. 3%. Joran's eyebrows rose. 3? Rated for 1,000 years, probably more. Leo crouched in front of the crest like he expected it to say something new if he stared long enough. He had grown up on drift stations and freight lanes like most of us. Earth, to him, was history file material. Something that existed in the educational archive beside old maps and extinct trade blocks and wars so far back no one remembered who'd started them. "To be known," he said quietly, echoing the line from the message. That's what they asked. No one answered him. Because the thing sitting in our cargo hold was not just old. It was patient. That was what got under my skin. A distress beacon screams. An emergency flare panics. This thing had not panicked. It had simply kept speaking into the dark with the dignity of something that believed eventually someone would answer. I pulled up the outer shell registry from the side port. The build date took a moment to resolve. Then the number appeared. Leo swore softly. Joran stopped pacing. I read it twice to make sure I hadn't misseen it. Launch date, 912 years ago. 9 centuries. 9 centuries of broadcasting the same introduction to a galaxy that had never bothered to respond. I felt something turn over inside me then. Not grief, not exactly. Grief implies personal loss. This was colder than that. More embarrassing. Like finding a letter still waiting on a doorstep long after the house around it had burned down. Joran crossed his arms. Fine, he said. Suppose we agree this is rare. Maybe valuable. Maybe historically obscene. What now? Leo looked up at me before I answered because he already knew he wasn't going to like it. We take it in, I said. Joran barked a humorless laugh. In where? To the assembly. That landed about as well as expected. Leo stood. Sarah, no. 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 The assembly is 27 days core ward if the lanes are kind, and the lanes are never kind. We are underfunded, underlicensed, and one engine cough away from becoming debris ourselves. Joran nodded toward the buoy. Finally, the navigator speaks sense. I ignored both of them and ran my hand over the scarred shell just above the Earth crest. The metal was cold. Old but not dead. This thing was built to be received by someone official, I said. Not traded in a scrap market. Not gutted for collector parts. Official. And you think the assembly cares? Joran asked. I looked at the slowly blinking power readout. 3%. Enough for years still if the estimate was right. Enough to keep talking long after the people who launched it had become a footnote. I don't know if they care, I said. I know they're going to hear it. Leo watched me for a long moment, weighing numbers against conviction the way he always did. Then he sighed and rubbed both hands over his face. I hate, he said, how often your terrible decisions become my route plans. That sounds like support. It sounds like I'm checking fuel margins. Joran muttered something impolite and went back toward the engine hatch. At the door he stopped and looked over one shoulder at me. If we do this, he said, I want it on record that I was against it before it ruined my week. Your week was already ruined. True, he admitted. But now it's themed. The hatch shut behind him. Leo remained beside the buoy a little longer, reading the old crest, listening to the voice loop begin again. This is the sole union of Earth, it said. We greet any listening civilization in peace. He looked at me. What if we're the first? I met his eyes across the dim hold. Then they waited long enough. An hour later, the Needle's Luck turned her nose away from the dead relay field and toward the core. Behind us, Vela's lantern continued to crumble in perfect silence. Ahead of us was the assembly, 27 days of bad fuel math, irritated machinery, and whatever happened when a ship nobody cared about arrived carrying proof that somebody should have cared a very long time ago. The first bad sign was that Earth still had a file. Not a legend entry. Not a myth marker. Not one of those educational archive capsules they use to package lost civilizations into neat, digestible sadness for schoolchildren. A file. An active archival designation nested inside assembly civilizational records under a category so old the Needle's Luck had to route through 3 dead index layers before the search engine admitted it existed. I found it on the 3rd day of transit. Joran was asleep in a maintenance sling he insisted was more comfortable than any bed ever built, which was either a lie or evidence of long-term spinal damage. Leo was in navigation running drift corrections with the expression of a man trying not to calculate exactly how little fuel margin my moral decisions had left us. I was in the cockpit with cold ration coffee and a public access legal terminal open across 3 screens. The file header read, Species designation, SL3/human Sci-Fi on status, cessation Sion class, V. Confirmed. That word sat there like a closed door. I opened the record. Most assembly files are built to defeat curiosity. Endless cross-references, procedural notes, subclauses feeding into other subclauses, the language growing thicker every page as if bureaucracy were a fungus that spread faster in darkness. I kept reading. By the 14th page I understood 2 things. First, humanity had not been erased in war. Second, the assembly had not even bothered to erase it properly. The official declaration had been filed 781 years earlier by the Civilizational Continuity Board, a committee with 9 permanent species seats and the authority to classify member polities as diminished, fragmented, suspended, or ceased. The findings cited converging indicators of irreversible planetary collapse, terminal infrastructure failure, and zero sustained diplomatic response from the Sol system. Converging indicators. I dug into the evidentiary annex. The first source was a long-range survey drone that had passed through the outer Sol drift and recorded severe radiation scarring around Mars' orbit and thermal anomalies on Earth's surface consistent with industrial firestorms. The second source was a merchant convoy report noting silence on registered diplomatic bans and no visible orbital traffic at Earth-Luna standard coordinates. The third was a strategic forecast paper written by some assembly analyst who had concluded that humanity's pre-collapse political fragmentation made species-level continuity statistically unlikely beyond 3 generations. A drone. A passing trade rumor. A predictive paper. That was enough, apparently, to bury a world. I leaned back slowly in the pilot's chair and stared at the screens until the letters blurred. Then I searched the one word that mattered. Verification. Assembly law was surprisingly clear about extinction. I found the clause in Charter Annex 41, buried under status review conditions and post-collapse determinations. No cessation finding could be finalized without physical verification. Not preferably. Not where practical. Not at committee discretion. Required. A ship had to be sent to recorded species coordinates. Contact attempts had to be made on all registered diplomatic and civil emergency frequencies. Surface, orbital, or habitat confirmation had to be entered into the primary record. I read the clause 3 times. Then I searched the Earth file for the verification log. There wasn't one. At first I thought the terminal had failed to load it. Then I found the waiver note. It was 11 lines long. The board had voted to waive direct verification because the corroborating evidence base was, in their words, sufficiently conclusive to justify administrative finalization without deployment of dedicated review resources. Administrative finalization. That was what they had called it. Not negligence. Not abandonment. Not deciding a species was probably gone and not worth the fuel to check. Administrative finalization. Leo appeared in the hatch behind me carrying 2 cups of machine coffee. He took one look at my face and didn't bother with his usual preamble. How bad? I turned the center screen toward him. He read in silence, then kept reading. By the time he reached the waiver section, his jaw had gone tight enough that I could see the tendon working. They never sent anyone, he said. No. They signed off extinction without direct contact. Yes. He read the clause again, slower this time. That's defective. It is. Not morally defective, he said, looking up at me now. Legally defective. I nodded once. He set my coffee down on the console without breaking eye contact with the screen. That means the record can be challenged. That means, I said, the record should never have been closed. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The ship hummed around us, old plating ticking as thermal stress adjusted along the hull. Somewhere aft, a fan bearing gave its usual dying in stages rattle. Beyond the forward glass, the corridor stars held their cold positions while the needle's luck threaded through dark space on a line I still had not fully allowed myself to believe. Leo sat down in the co-pilot chair. So now it isn't just a relic. No. It's evidence. Yes. Of procedural failure on a species-level declaration. I smiled without humor. You make that sound romantic. I make that sound actionable. That was why I kept Leo around. Joran arrived 10 minutes later because ship gossip travels faster than light when the ship only has 3 people on it. He came in wiping sealant off his forearms with a rag that had lost the war against Greece years ago. Tell me, he said, that whatever you found is not making this trip worse. Leo turned the side display toward him. Joran read less patiently than Leo had. He skipped, backtracked, swore once, then read the verification clause in full. When he finished, he looked at me. They never checked. No. They filed extinction because the paperwork felt close enough. Yes. He rubbed both hands over his face. There are many kinds of anger. Joran's was usually loud and practical. The useful sort, built for broken parts and bad decisions and people who deserved a hard landing. This anger was quieter. That made it worse. My grandmother used to tell me, he said slowly, that if a station doesn't answer hails, you don't write empty in the log. You keep knocking until you know. I looked back at the Earth file. At the stamped finality. At the clean, dead certainty of people who had turned distance into confidence. They didn't keep knocking, I said. No, Joran said. They didn't. Leo was already opening a fresh document on his console. What are you doing? I asked. Building the challenge packet. You believe me that quickly? He gave me a look. Sarah, the law is on screen. This isn't faith. This is clerical homicide. Joran barked out one short laugh at that, then pointed at the file. If we're going to walk into the assembly and tell them they buried a species wrong, I want every line of this indexed, cross-cited, and ready to shove down an administrator's throat. Professionally, Leo added. Obviously professionally. I turned back to the forward viewport. The stars had not changed. Nothing had changed, not really. Earth was still listed dead in the main record. The buoy was still in cargo too, still introducing a civilization the galaxy had filed into silence. We were still 3 underfunded nobodies on a salvage tug with no business poking the center of power. And yet, the shape of the trip had changed. Before we were carrying an old voice. Now we were carrying proof. I opened a new ship log entry and after a moment's thought, wrote only one sentence. They did not verify the dead. Then I sealed the entry, locked the challenge file, and plotted our remaining days to the assembly. Ahead of us was the station, the chamber, the record, and somewhere beyond all of that, maybe, the first real question the galaxy had failed to ask in 800 years. If humanity was never properly declared gone, what else had survived in the dark after the paperwork stopped looking? By the 6th day, the needle's luck smelled like hot wiring, ration salt, and bad resolve. That was normal. What was less normal was that all 3 of us now moved through the ship with the careful tension of people pretending they were still making a small decision. We were not. Small decisions end when you stop arguing about them. This one had grown roots. Joran spent most of the morning half buried inside the port stabilizer housing, swearing at a coolant relay that had chosen exactly this week to become philosophical about pressure retention. Leo had 4 route screens open at once and was shaving fuel loss by fractions so tiny they would have seemed insulting if they were not the only reason we still had a margin at all. I sat in the cockpit cross-indexing assembly procedure with docking protocol, species recognition law, and every old Earth registry fragment I could pull from public archives before some clever clerk realized what channel traffic we were generating. The buoy remained in cargo too. Every 43 seconds, unless someone muted it, the voice began again. This is the sole union of Earth. At some point I stopped hearing it as a recording. It had become part of the ship. Like engine vibration. Like the life support fan over my bunk that clicked once every 2 minutes. Like Joran muttering at machinery as if guilt could improve performance. Leo came into the cockpit with a tablet in one hand and a face that meant numbers had done something unpleasant. We need to talk about reality, he said. That sounds expensive. It is. He set the tablet down between us. Projected fuel consumption glowed in amber lines across the screen. Our current course to the assembly station already pushed the luck beyond the operating comfort of both her engines and my conscience. Any delay at all, customs hold, traffic reroute, docking queue, enforcement inspection, would cut so deep into our reserves that leaving again became theoretical. If they deny us berth, Leo said, we do not have the fuel to loiter. We have credentials. We have ancient credentials. Ancient is still valid if no one cancelled it. He gave me the look he reserved for statements that were technically true and spiritually irresponsible. Technically, he said, yes. Good. I'm very interested in technically. That's because technically is all we have. He was right. That was the problem. We had no military escort. No sponsor. No recognized mission authority. No living government speaking for us. Just an old buoy, a dead species file that should never have been closed, and a ship so small the assembly probably used bigger craft to move ceremonial furniture. Joran filled the cockpit hatch without warning, rag over one shoulder, knuckles black with grease. If this is the part where either of you suggests turning back, he said, I want notice so I can insult you efficiently. No one said turning back, Leo replied. Good. Joran dropped into the jump seat by the bulkhead and tilted his head toward the fuel projections. How doomed? Leo lifted one hand. Operationally delicate. That bad then? Very. I closed the chart and leaned back. We dock, we file challenge, we get on record. That's the objective. Joran studied me for a second too long. That is not the full objective. No, I admitted. It's the first one. He nodded once, slow. That was another reason I trusted Joran. He was not sentimental, but he understood escalation. A damaged stabilizer becomes a hull breach if you ignore it long enough. Bad paperwork becomes history if no one fights it early. What happens after we get on record? He asked. I opened the secondary slate Pyrie had left linked to the public signal sweep. I was waiting for her to say it herself, I said. As if summoned by being discussed, Pyrie appeared in the doorway with 3 data tabs clipped together and the expression she wore when she had found something too large to fit neatly inside one emotion. There are more, she said. Joran frowned. More what? People. She crossed the cockpit and spread the tabs over the console. For the past 2 days she had been combing old open band transmission ghosting, registry leaks, abandoned routing metadata, and any fringe traffic archive old enough to still contain patterns newer systems had stopped caring about. Pyrie was 19, station-born, unregistered by any formal census, and better at seeing hidden structures in neglected data than most official analysts would be after 3 promotions and a government stipend. The screen filled with scattered markers. Not many by galactic scale. Too many by extinction standards. 17 likely matches, she said. Human-coded broadcast architecture, old soul syntax drift, generational compression signatures, colony band inheritance patterns. A few are weak. Some may be dead relays. But not all of them. Leo stared. Joran stopped moving entirely, which on him counted as astonishment. 17, he said. That's what I can support with evidence, Pyrie replied. There may be more. I looked at the map and felt the story change shape in my head. Before, this had been about a lie in the record. Now it was about the population hidden behind the lie. Human stations in dark lanes. Colony hulls still moving. Settlements built in orbit around nothing the assembly still bothered to label important. People living for generations inside the administrative blind spots of empire. Not extinct. Just unwitnessed. Leo exhaled slowly. We should contact them. No, I said. Both he and Joran turned. No. Leo repeated. Not yet. Pyrie watched me carefully. She knew I was not dismissing the idea. She was waiting for the why. If we contact them now, I said, we send panic into 17 unknown populations with no legal foothold, no public status, and no guarantee the assembly won't dismiss us before lunch. We don't give scattered people hope on a maybe. Joran leaned forward, elbows on knees. So we get the maybe into the record first. Yes. Then we call. Yes. Leo rubbed at his eyes. That is, he said, a horrible amount of pressure to put on 3 people and 1 docking request. I looked from him to Joran to Pyrie, then back to the map. 3 people. 1 salvage tug. A buoy that had not given up in 9 centuries because no one had told it how. That's what we have, I said. Joran stood. Then I'm reinforcing the docking seals. Leo blinked at him. That's your reaction? My reaction, Joran said, already heading for the hatch, is that if we are about to walk into the center of galactic government representing a species they buried wrong, I would prefer our ship not explode during final approach. Standards matter. He vanished aft. Pyrie remained where she was, looking at the 17 faint markers on the screen. Do you think they know? She asked quietly. The others. That they were declared extinct? She nodded. I thought about that. About silence settling into habit. About whole communities learning to survive by staying beneath notice. About what it does to a people when the wider universe stops expecting them to be there. Some of them probably do, I said. Some of them probably stopped caring what the file said. And some of them. I touched one of the weaker traces with a fingertip. Some of them may have spent generations thinking there was no one left to argue with it. Pyrie's mouth tightened. We're going to change that. It was not a question. No, I said. We're going to start changing that. I'm trying to become a more accurate person. Leo let out a short laugh despite himself. Outside the forward glass, the stars of the inner corridors burned colder and denser than the outer drift. Somewhere ahead was the assembly. Somewhere beyond that waited old procedures, older arrogance, and a room full of beings who had spent centuries treating humanity as resolved. Behind us in Cargo 2, the buoy continued speaking to anyone willing to listen. We were ready to be known. For the first time since pulling it from the wreck field, I understood that the message had never really been meant for the assembly. Not only for them. It was meant for whoever was left. And if we managed not to fail the next time it was heard, it would not be by 3 nobodies alone. It would be by the dead returning to count themselves. Meridian spoke looked less like a station and more like a decision someone had made against the sky. We saw it first as a distortion in the traffic web ahead, an interruption so large that the navigation display tried twice to classify it as orbital infrastructure belonging to a small moon. Then the long-range optics resolved, and all 3 of us went quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with scale. The assembly had built its center the way old institutions built everything important. Too large to question and too old to embarrass. Meridian spoke rose and nested tiers around a central axis that disappeared into glare. Docking crowns ringed it in widening bands, hundreds of berths lit in disciplined arcs, freight lanes braided between diplomatic sectors, civilian transit spines, shuttle nests and military exclusion corridors. Traffic moved around it in constant layers, so regulated and so continuous it looked less like ships and more like a weather system built out of obedience. The needle's luck was approximately the size of a maintenance inconvenience. Joran stood behind the pilot chair with both hands braced on the bulkhead, staring through the forward glass. "If anyone asks," he said, "we are here to improve their standards through contrast." Leo did not look up from the approach board. "If anyone asks," he said, "we are here because you tightened Dock Seal 3 past recommended tolerance." "It worked, didn't it?" it complained. "That's not the same thing." Pyrie had not spoken at all since the station came into full view. She sat in the co-pilot chair with the human trace map minimized in one corner of her display and the old Earth registry file open in the center, eyes moving over the same lines again and again as if repetition might make them feel less absurd. Ancient credentials. A dead species. One legal birth assignment no one had ever thought to revoke because revocation required procedure and procedure required imagination, and institutions like the Assembly rarely imagined the dead would come back asking technical questions. I opened the diplomatic band. The frequency still existed. That nearly made me laugh. It sat there in the registry like a room someone had reserved and then forgotten to unlock. The channel header still carried the old Earth filing designation. No updates. No handover. No reassignment. Just 9 centuries of administrative dust and one very expensive oversight. I keyed the transmitter. "Meridian spoke Port Authority," I said. "This is Independent Vessel Needle's Luck transmitting under Seoul Union Diplomatic Registry request. We are petitioning birth recognition under original accession filing." For a few seconds, there was only static and the soft mechanical chatter of the luck-correcting drift. Then the response came. Automated at first. Crisp. Neutral. Built to process ordinary things. Unidentified vessel, transmit full registry, species designation, and docking claim authorization. I sent the Earth file. All of it. Original diplomatic filing, accession request, buoy registry, species designation, the still active channel record, and the birth assignment tied to a status that had never formally been closed. The packet left our comm array in a burst of encrypted data older than anything else our ship had transmitted in its entire miserable life. The reply took longer this time. Long enough that Leo looked at the fuel margin display twice and Joran muttered, "Any silence over 30 seconds becomes insulting." At 41 seconds, a live voice replaced the automated one. Professional. Controlled. Not calm. "Vessel transmitting Seoul Union Registry," the voice said, "please confirm the filing reference attached to your request is not archival spoofing." "Confirmed," I said. Pause. "Please confirm your claim of diplomatic continuity under Registry Year 118 Assembly Standard." "Confirmed." The voice on the other end inhaled once, very quietly. "That filing remains listed as dormant pending arrival." "We have arrived," I said. No one on the bridge moved. Not me, not Leo, not Pyrie, not even Joran, who usually twitched like an offended engine component under tension. The Port Authority line went silent for 11 full seconds. Then, "Maintain current approach lane. Your request is under direct review." Joran leaned down between the pilot seats. "I would like it entered into the record," he said, "that this is the most satisfying sentence I have heard in years." Leo did not smile. "That means someone senior is awake now." "Good," I said. "I'd hate to make history and have it processed by a clerk." "That is exactly," Leo replied, "how most history gets processed." He was right, of course. That was the whole problem. We drifted in holding pattern while Meridian spoke decided what to do with a ship carrying proof that its records had been allowed to rot into certainty. Around us the traffic lanes continued their flawless choreography. Giant freight hulls moved like patient continents. Diplomatic cutters slid past in polished silence. Shuttle swarms flashed along service veins between sectors. Not one vessel altered course for us. The universe rarely paused because you had reached the interesting part. At last the channel reopened. This voice was older. Smoother. The kind of voice built by decades spent turning institutional uncertainty into orderly outcomes. "This is Senior Dock Registrar Thel of Meridian spoke," it said. "Your claim has been examined against surviving accession records. Birth designation D14 remains legally assigned to the Seoul Union pending plenary admission. The berth is currently unoccupied." Joran made a small choking sound that might have been joy. The registrar continued. "Under Assembly Docking Code, the station is obligated to honor any still valid diplomatic assignment absent formal revocation." Leo shut his eyes briefly. Pyrie whispered, "They forgot to close the door." I kept my voice level. Then open it. Another pause. Then. Needle's luck, you are cleared to proceed to diplomatic dock 14. Maintain assigned vector and transmit compliance acknowledgement. I acknowledged. The lane lights ahead shifted from amber to white. For one strange second all I could think about was the buoy and cargo too. 9 centuries of speaking into emptiness. And now a line of light opening. Dock 14 lay in one of the older diplomatic sectors, half buried under newer construction. The berth architecture was narrower than the modern cradles, built for vessels from an era when species apparently believed a mission ship should still resemble a ship and not a drifting palace. It fit the Needle's luck with humiliating generosity. The docking arms latched. Pressure equalized. Our status board went green across systems that had no business trusting us with anything. Joran exhaled through his teeth. Well, he said. That worked. Leo turned in his chair. No, he said. That opened. Working is what happens next. He looked at me when he said it. He didn't need to add anything else. The berth umbilical attached with a hard metallic seal that echoed through the hull. On the external feed, the diplomatic crest above Dock 14 flickered awake for the first time in what had to be centuries, its old line work brightening through layers of disuse until the sole Union emblem glowed pale gold over our hatch. Pyrie was the first to stand. She stared at the feed for a long moment, then asked very softly, "Do we change?" Joran looked down at his work jacket, at the sealed tear near one shoulder and the half-scrubbed coolant stain on one sleeve. No, he said. Let them meet us as filed. That was the right answer. We stepped through the airlock exactly as we were. My boots still carried dust from salvage decks. Leo's sleeves were rolled past his wrists because formality had never once improved his thinking. Pyrie wore station workwear with the repair patches visible because invisibility had already taken enough from her life and she had no intention of cooperating with it now. Behind us, on a mag sled, the buoy came with us, scarred shell and fading crest and all. The receiving corridor beyond the dock was empty at first. Then it wasn't. Information moves fast in power centers but not in straight lines. First a dock technician stopped mid-step. Then 2 transit clerks at the far checkpoint turned to stare. Then a pair of diplomatic aides in silver collar bands froze long enough for someone behind them to notice that freezing and follow their gaze. By the time we reached the main connector into the civic hub, the silence had begun. Not complete silence. The shaped kind. The spreading kind. The kind made by 100 beings trying not to admit they were looking at something impossible. Meridian Spoke had seen humans before, of course. In history galleries. In archival exhibits. In educational simulations about lost civilizations and the statistical fragility of emerging interstellar powers. What it had not seen in 800 years was 3 breathing ones walking in on a legal berth under their own dead government's active registry. I kept moving. That helped. If you walk like you belong somewhere, bureaucracy becomes briefly uncertain whether it has already approved you. The hub opened ahead of us in glass, light and layered motion. Transit bridges crossed overhead in silver lines. Species from half the known systems moved through the space in streams organized by customs so old it had hardened into architecture. And through the middle of all of it, we went, 3 nobodies from a salvage tug and a buoy that had outlasted the patience of empires. No one stopped us. Not because they wanted to let us pass. Because procedure had not caught up yet. At the far side of the hub, beyond the customs lattice and the public registries, the assembly administrative corridors waited in quiet geometric rows. Somewhere deeper inside them was the chamber. Somewhere beyond that was the record. And somewhere inside both was a species-sized error that had finally docked in person. I adjusted my grip on the mag sled handle and kept walking. The hardest part of reaching the center of power, I was learning, was not getting in. It was arriving before the system had written down why you shouldn't be there. The chamber was built to make people feel proportional. That was my first thought when the doors opened. Not small exactly. Smaller than the institution. Smaller than the history stored in its walls. Smaller than the weight of whatever the assembly had already decided before anyone stepped up to speak. The Hall of Accord dropped away in descending arcs of dark stone and pale light, tier after tier of delegate seating curving toward a central speaking floor polished so perfectly it reflected everyone standing on it like a judgment. Above, the ceiling disappeared into a lattice of suspended memory glass, each panel faintly luminous, each one preserving the official record in visual trace. The air carried the hum of translation matrices so dense I could feel them at the back of my teeth. Leo leaned slightly toward me as we entered. I hate this place already, he murmured. That's healthy, I said. Pyrie said nothing. She was looking upward, eyes moving over the galleries, the delegate banks, the old species crests worked into the chamber ribs. I knew what she was seeing. Proof of who had counted long enough to decorate the architecture. We walked down the central aisle with the buoy on its mag sled between us. The chamber was nearly full. That would have been unusual for a technical emergency review on any ordinary cycle. For an old file challenge brought by 3 unregistered humans in salvage clothes carrying a 9th century diplomatic buoy? Apparently attendance had become mandatory for anyone with a functioning sense of curiosity. At the primary dais sat the speaker. A Vethari, silver-skinned, fine-boned, expression composed into the kind of neutrality only people with centuries in office could make look effortless. I had spent half the transit reading public proceedings and knew 2 useful things about her. First, she was exacting. Second, she disliked being surprised in public. We had already failed her on the second point. Proceed, she said. No introduction. No ceremony. Good. I brought the mag sled to a stop at the center podium and disengaged the field. The buoy settled against the stone with a heavy metallic thud that echoed outward through the chamber. That got their attention in a different way. An artifact is one thing at a distance. Weight changes people's relationship to truth. A senior delegate from the Vath coalition stood almost immediately. He was tall, draped in layered formal black, voice smooth with old confidence. Before this session is contaminated by spectacle, he said, the coalition wishes to enter procedural objection. Species designation Sol 3 has been listed as ceased for 8 centuries. No standing representation exists. No recognized polity has authorized. The objection is noted, the speaker said without looking at him. It will not be heard first. He sat down very carefully. I liked her more already. The speaker turned her gaze toward me. State your claim. I placed both hands lightly on the buoy's scarred shell. My claim, I said, is that the Assembly filed humanity has gone without completing the verification required by its own law. No one interrupted. That helped. I activated the buoy. The chamber filled with the voice. This is the sole union of Earth. We greet any listening civilization in peace. We request recognition, exchange, and open contact. Our coordinates are attached. We are ready to be known. The words went out through the translation grid in clean, layered tones. No static. No distortion. No melodrama. Just a calm introduction from a civilization the galaxy had already moved into its historical cabinets. I let the full message play. Then let it begin again. Only then did I cut the audio. This beacon, I said, was recovered from a debris orbit at the edge of Vela's lantern. It has been transmitting continuously for 912 years. Current power reserves remain above 3%. Absent recovery, it would have continued broadcasting for approximately another century and a half. Across the chamber, a few delegates had gone very still. That was good. Stillness meant the point had landed before they could decide what language to hide inside. I brought up the first legal display. The relevant clause expanded above the podium in Assembly Standard Script and 12 translated variants. Charter Annex 41, I said, Status Review Conditions, subsection 9. No cessation finding may be finalized without direct verification at recorded species coordinates. A review vessel must be dispatched. Contact must be attempted on all registered diplomatic and civil emergency frequencies. Sensor confirmation must be entered into the primary record. I looked up. None of that was done. Now the chamber reacted. Not wildly. Not yet. But the sound shifted, murmurs breaking across translation bands, aides leaning to confer, private side channels opening in subtle flashes of desk light. The Vath delegate rose again. The historical record contains corroborating evidence. It contains substitute evidence, I said, turning toward him. Not legal verification. That sharpened the room. Good. I pulled up the archived cessation file and highlighted the relevant sections one by one. A long-range survey drone. A merchant traffic report. A predictive analysis paper. Those are the 3 cited evidentiary bases used to waive direct verification. None satisfy the standard required by the Charter. None authorize final extinction classification. The filing was made anyway. The Vath delegate opened his mouth. The speaker raised one hand. He closed it again. That helped too. This is not, I said, a philosophical dispute. It is not a request for sympathy. It is not an appeal to historical sentiment. It is a procedural defect in a species-level declaration. The Assembly's own mechanisms define what happens when such a defect exists. I brought up the next clause. Improperly finalized cessation findings are subject to contestation, suspension, and formal review. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that happens when power recognizes its own handwriting on the weapon pointed at it. The speaker regarded me for several long seconds. Then she asked the right question. You represent 3 individuals on an independent salvage vessel. What living population do you claim to speak for? I've been waiting for that. I nodded to Pyrie. She stepped forward and placed a second data cluster into the system. 17 mapped human-coded traces flared across the chamber in blue-white points, weak, scattered, incomplete, but undeniably there. During transit, I said, we identified multiple active human origin transmission signatures beyond current assembly civil registry. Generation ships. Fringe settlements. Drift stations. Uncounted populations using inherited soul band encoding. We do not yet claim total census authority. We claim living continuity. The map hung there. Not dramatic in the way fleets are dramatic. Worse. Quiet evidence is harder to dismiss because it leaves less room for pretending you misheard. We are here, I said. The beacon is here. The record is wrong. That is enough to open the door. A junior delegate somewhere in the upper tiers actually stood halfway up before realizing he hadn't meant to. The speaker did not move. Neither did I. At last she said, the chamber will recess for deliberation. It was not victory. But it was not dismissal. And for a species that had spent 8 centuries in the wrong tense, that mattered more than anyone in the room was yet prepared to admit. As security aides moved toward the side access corridors, Leo came up beside me without taking his eyes off the delegate rows. How bad do you think that was for them? He asked under his breath. I looked at the buoy, at the scarred old shell and the still glowing status strip, then at the chamber that had finally heard it. Not bad enough yet, I said. But better than this morning. Then I put my hands back on the mag sled and followed the aides into the waiting corridor, leaving behind a room full of powerful beings who had just been forced to confront the simplest and most dangerous sentence any institution can hear. Your paperwork buried people who were still alive. The ruling took 3 hours. That was longer than Leo had predicted, shorter than Joran had feared, and exactly long enough for the waiting room assigned to contested civilizational matters to begin feeling like a joke written by people who had never expected to need the category. We sat in a narrow chamber off the Hall of Accord with one glass wall turned opaque for privacy and the buoy resting between our chairs like a 4th delegate that had outlived everyone who originally voted for it. No one said much. Pyrie stood most of the time, arms folded, eyes unfocused in that way she had when she was running through data structures too large to fit on a single screen. Leo reread the challenge packet twice and then a 3rd time, not because he thought the words would improve, but because rereading gave his hands something to do. Joran paced exactly 12 steps from wall to wall, turned, paced back, and repeated the cycle until the floor and I both began to resent him. At some point a station aide brought us water and looked at the buoy longer than she looked at us. That, more than anything else, told me the session had gone badly for someone. The recall tone finally came through the room speaker with all the emotional warmth of a surgical instrument. Challenge parties to chamber. Joran stopped pacing immediately. Well, he said, if they've decided to arrest us, I'd appreciate advance notice so I can stand in a memorable way. No one is arresting us, Leo said. You sound unconvinced. I sound realistic. Pyrie put both hands on the mag sled handle before either of them could continue. Take your realism with you, she said. We're going back in. The chamber had changed by the time we returned. Not in architecture. Not in seating. Not in procedure. In temperature. A room full of powerful people trying to look unchanged after being forced to hear their own mistake develops a very specific atmosphere, colder than outrage, tighter than surprise. Delegates were sitting straighter now. More private screens were active. Translation lattices hummed at higher intensity. Entire blocks that had been visibly restless before had settled into the stillness of species already calculating consequences. The speaker waited until we resumed our place at the floor podium. Then she delivered the finding in the same precise tone she had used for everything else, which somehow made it heavier. The Assembly has reviewed the procedural objection attached to the cessation record of species designation Sol 3, commonly known as humanity. No preamble. Good. The challenge is found materially sufficient. That sentence struck the chamber like a crack through glass. Not loud. Structural. The existing cessation classification is hereby annotated as defective pending full review. Effective immediately, the Sol 3 species record will be amended from ceased to disputed continuity status under active assembly examination. Disputed continuity. It was not restoration. It was not victory. But it was no longer death. The speaker continued. Original diplomatic registry rights attached to the Seoul Union accession filing are reinstated in provisional form for the duration of review. A formal census and continuity hearing will be scheduled. Territorial consequences remain suspended pending evidentiary process. I heard only half of that. Because in the moment after she said no longer ceased, something inside me that had been braced since we pulled the buoy from the wreck field loosened by one careful degree. Beside me, Pyrie made the smallest sound in the world. Not a laugh. Not a sob. More like the body discovering it had been holding still too hard. Across the chamber, the Vath coalition delegates had already begun conferring in tight, furious silence. Good. Let them. The record had moved. Records matter because once a system says a thing publicly, it has to spend energy unsaying it. And energy, unlike pride, is finite. The speaker's gaze found me again. Representative Sarah Vale, the title felt strange in her mouth and stranger in my ears. The Assembly recognizes your filing for the purposes of continuation review. You will submit all available continuity evidence within 20 standard days. We will, I said. The speaker inclined her head once. Then the chamber is adjourned. The noise started before we reached the side doors. Not chaos. Not yet. More like pressure venting through 1,000 controlled leaks at once. Delegates speaking too fast across muted channels, aides running procedural polls, observers in the public galleries turning to one another with faces that all meant the same thing in different species. They weren't gone. We did not stop in the corridor. I kept walking until the Hall of Accord was 2 turns behind us and the walls had changed from ceremonial stone to ordinary administrative alloy. Only then did Joran exhale hard enough to make it theatrical. Disputed continuity, he said. That is the ugliest beautiful phrase I have ever heard. It means we exist in the record again, Pyrie said. Leo had his terminal open before she finished speaking. No, he said, eyes already moving. It means the public registry is updating. He turned the screen toward us. There it was. The species designation had changed in real time. Sol, 3/humanity status. Disputed continuity, review active. 4 words. That was all. 4 words to replace 8 centuries of official absence. Pyrie stared at them so long I thought she might forget to breathe. We send now, she said. I looked at her. She didn't ask permission often. She usually worked around needing it. This time she did. The 17 mapped traces she had found during transit still sat unsent in her queue, each one a possible human settlement or generational ship or drift habitat that had survived by becoming too small for Empire to notice. We had agreed to wait until there was something real to tell them. Now there was. I nodded. Send. We ran for the ship. Not literally, Meridian Spoke would have frowned on that, but fast enough that station staff moved aside without being asked. Dock 14 seemed much smaller when we reached it, maybe because the impossible part had already happened inside the chamber and now we were down to the work that came after impossible things. Pyrie was in the comm seat before the hatch sealed. Leo routed power priority away from non-essential comfort systems without being told. Joran checked signal integrity twice, then a 3rd time because if this moment failed on his watch, he intended to fail it thoroughly. Pyrie built the message in under 2 minutes. Not fancy. Not diplomatic. Human. To any human settlement, vessel, or surviving network receiving on legacy soul code bands. Assembly cessation record has been challenged and amended. Humanity is now listed as disputed continuity under active review. You are no longer dead in the official record. Transmit status, population, and need. This channel is held open. She stopped typing and looked back at me. Too much. Not enough, Joran said. Send it anyway, I told her. She did. The message went out on all 17 traces, plus every old soul-coded general band we could resurrect from the registry. It left the needle's luck in overlapping bursts of signal light so ordinary-looking that anyone watching the hull from outside would never have guessed a species was trying to speak its own name back into existence. Then we waited. The first reply took 47 minutes. Pyrie saw it before the tone finished sounding. Her hands froze over the console. Source. Leo asked. Outer drift lane. Weak carrier. Human coded. Open it. Pyrie did. Text only. Fragmented at first, then resolving line by line across the display. Received. Confirmed human settlement. Transit habitat Keshet line. Population 11,204. We believe the old status permanent. Repeat. Do we understand correctly that humanity now exists in the assembly record? No one on the bridge spoke. Joran sat down without seeming to realize he had done it. Leo read the message twice. Then Pyrie looked at me, eyes bright in a way I had never seen on her before. What do I say? That question hit harder than the chamber had. Because the answer was no longer procedural. It was civilizational. I stepped closer to her console and keyed the reply myself. Yes. The record changed today. Hold position. Send full habitat status and critical needs. You are not alone. I read it once, then sent it. Joran looked at the outbound confirmation and scrubbed one hand over his mouth. We should have found them earlier, he said quietly. Leo didn't look away from the incoming channel. We weren't ready earlier. Neither were they, Pyrie said. The second reply came 11 minutes after the first. Then a third. One from a convoy-borne schoolship still running a generational route toward a destination that no longer belonged to the map they'd launched with. One from a mining station hidden inside a dead comet cluster, population 806, requesting verification that this was not an assembly entrapment signal. One from a single crew deepwatch relay who sent only 4 words. Still here. Still listening. By the time Meridian spoke rotated into night cycle, we had 9 confirmed responses. By morning there were 23. Human settlements. Human vessels. Human children growing up in places the assembly had never marked as inhabited because no one had bothered to look twice. Some sent clean population numbers. Some sent damage reports. Some sent questions so practical they broke my heart. Can we use our old flag again? Do we tell the young ones now? Is it safe to say where we are? What happens if the review fails? Pyrie answered until her voice went rough and her hands started to shake from exhaustion. Leo built a continuity matrix for every responding settlement and started sorting by urgency. Joran quietly rerouted life support reserves to keep the comm array overclocked, then pretended not to notice when I saw him do it. Around us, Meridian spoke continued its endless, polished routines. Traffic lanes held. Delegations moved. Committee schedules updated. Somewhere deep in the station, the assembly would already be spinning the implications outward into legal time. Let it. On our bridge, the dead were answering. And every new response did the same thing the first one had done. It made humanity harder to bury with paperwork ever again. By the 3rd day after the registry changed, the first formal objection arrived. It came from the Vath Coalition on paper so polished it looked expensive to disagree with. 42 pages of respectful alarm, jurisdictional concern, continuity doctrine, and phrases like historic reliance interests and infrastructure dependency impact, all arranged in the careful language powerful blocks use when they want to say we built a great many things on top of your disappearance and would strongly prefer not to revisit that fact. Leo read the opening summary, snorted once and passed it to me. They aren't contesting the defect, he said. They know they can't. No, I said, scanning the second page. They're contesting consequences. That was worse in some ways. A clean villain is easy to fight. A species with farms and old soul belts, trade lanes routed through human-claimed dark space, and 8 centuries of investment built on a bad declaration gets to sound reasonable while defending theft by inertia. Joran leaned against the hatch with his arms folded. So what I'm hearing is, we are no longer dead, but a lot of important people would like us to remain logistically convenient. That, I said, is an excellent summary of galactic politics. Pyrie did not laugh. She was at the comm station, headset around her neck, 3 settlement channels open at once and a 4th blinking for response. In the 4 days since the assembly amended humanity's status, the count had risen from 23 confirmed replies to 31. Stations, drift clusters, convoy habitats, a mining lattice hidden inside a comet spine, 2 generational craft, 1 agricultural ring built around the stripped skeleton of a pre-collapse colony ark. Some asked for legal guidance. Some asked for maps. Some asked questions so simple they made the room go quiet after they were answered. Can our children use the word Earth in school records now? Recognition, I was learning, did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as paperwork, hesitation, and the slow terrifying realization that all the structures built to survive invisibility now had to decide whether they were ready to be seen. The review office assigned us 3 consultation rooms, 1 clerk, and an evidentiary schedule that extended 63 days into the future. I laughed when I saw that. Not because it was funny. Because bureaucracy, unlike drama, rarely knew when it had already become a joke. The continuity hearing had only opened the file. Now came subcommittee examinations, census thresholds, route map submissions, standing arguments, territorial overlays, diplomatic sponsorship requirements, and the Assembly's favorite sport, determining whether a living problem could be delayed until it became administratively smoother. We need an internal block, Leo said that night, spreading 3 delegate maps across the mess table. Not sympathy. Not curiosity. A species already inside the chamber with enough procedural weight to keep the file moving. Everyone in there has weight, Joran said. That's why the chairs are so large. I mean allies, Leo replied. I knew he was right. The registry change had created a crack. Cracks are not doors unless someone keeps pressure on them. The message came the next morning. Not on the public review channel. Not through the general clerking office. A private diplomatic ping routed directly to our provisional Seoul Union docket. I opened it expecting another objection. Instead, it contained a request. Delegate Sarah Vale, if you are willing, the Tesh Archive mission requests a private meeting regarding the original cessation file. Timing flexible. Discretion preferred. Joran, reading over my shoulder, frowned. The Tesh. I searched the name. The Tesh Collective held one full assembly seat, old enough to be treated as furniture by the larger blocks and patient enough to survive the insult. Their representatives were known for abstaining loudly and filing minority language that future historians liked more than current governments did. I looked up. Set the meeting, I said. The Tesh mission occupied a quieter ring of Meridian spoke, far from the prestige corridors and close to the archival vault interfaces, which felt appropriate. Their reception chamber was low-lit, narrow, and lined with suspended memory strips that moved gently in recycled air like pale leaves underwater. The delegate waiting for us introduced himself as Elder Archivist Sun Var. He was older than any human I had ever met, his skin matte silver at the edges, eyes dark and steady, posture aided by a shaped walking brace that clicked softly every time he shifted weight. He did not waste time on courtesy flourishes. I asked for privacy, he said once we were seated, because institutions become embarrassed before they become honest. That has also been my experience, I said. Something almost like approval crossed his face. He tapped the table between us, and a file projection unfolded into the air. Not our challenge packet. An older one. Different seal. Older formatting. Archive deep. I recognized the Earth designation immediately. This, Sinvar said, is the minority brief filed against the final cessation ruling. I looked up sharply. There was a minority brief? There are always minority briefs, he said. The assembly survives partly because someone, somewhere, usually writes down the truth before it is ignored. The file rotated slowly. 3 signatories. 1 Tesh. 1 from a species now dissolved into combined representation. 1 independent legal observer whose office had been retired centuries ago. I opened the brief. It was clean, devastating, and only 12 pages long. It argued exactly what I had argued in the Hall of Accord. No direct verification, no legal finalization. The drone evidence was insufficient. The waiver was abusive. The cessation should have been suspended pending physical review. They knew, I said quietly. Some did. And they lost. Yes. Sinvar folded his hands over the head of his walking brace. The difference between a wrong decision and a durable wrong decision, he said, is usually paperwork plus time. You have interrupted the time. That sentence stayed with me. I read the brief to the end. At the bottom, below the original signatures, the Tesh archival seal had been renewed twice over the centuries, each renewal preserving the descent as active record rather than allowing it to sink into dead storage. You kept it alive, I said. Sinvar inclined his head slightly. We kept the argument alive. There is a distinction. Why? For the first time since we entered, his gaze shifted away from me, toward the hanging memory strips along the wall. My predecessor believed, he said, that extinction findings reveal more about the civilization issuing them than the civilization being buried by them. He considered your file educational. Joran liked him immediately. I could tell because Joran stopped looking annoyed and started looking interested, which on him was practically affection. Sinvar keyed another screen. This time it showed delegate support patterns. Colored blocks. Likely alignments. Procedural probabilities. The Vath coalition will fight restoration of territorial review with everything it has, he said. They're not wrong to fear cost. But fear makes large blocks clumsy. Smaller missions are already shifting. He pointed to 7 highlighted seats. The Tesh will support full continuity review. The N archivists are moving the same direction. The RAL mediation houses will not lead, but they can be persuaded to stand in public if the census evidence expands. 2 others are waiting for proof that humanity is not merely alive, but distributed. Pyrie sat forward. 31 settlements isn't enough? It is enough to disturb, Sinvar said. Not yet enough to settle. He looked at me again. You need more than a chamber argument now. You need presence. Numbers. Distances. Needs. Histories. You need to turn living continuity into administrative mass. Leo exhaled softly. Build a species file faster than they can delay one. Precisely. I should have felt daunted. Instead, I felt something much simpler. Direction. Before we left, Sinvar slid a hard copy strip across the table. Formal support? I asked. Not yet, he said. This is better. I looked down. It was a list of archival references, dormant transit cases, precedent rulings, and 3 names of delegates whose public positions were misleadingly mild compared to their private irritation with Vath overreach. A war map if you were the sort of person who fought with filings instead of fleets. At some point, I said, you decided to help us before meeting us. He adjusted the brace at his wrist. At some point, he replied, I became tired of living inside systems that only correct themselves when embarrassed properly. Back aboard the Needle's Luck, I pinned the Tesh brief above the main console. Pyrie reopened all active settlement channels. Leo began restructuring the evidence matrix by population, location, and continuity depth. Joran took one look at the growing lists and muttered, We have gone from impossible errand to government. Temporary government, I said. He grimaced. That's how the permanent ones start. That night the replies reached 38. By morning, 42. Humanity was no longer just a wronged file or a ghost in a chamber. It was becoming a dossier too large to ignore politely. And inside the assembly for the first time, we were no longer the only ones saying so. The 43rd reply arrived while I was asleep. Pyrie woke me by throwing a soft datapad at my shoulder with the kind of accuracy that suggested she had been waiting years for a morally defensible reason to do it. I sat up hard, grabbed the pad and squinted at the message through sleep blur. It was short. Not because the sender lacked words. Because they had learned to ration hope carefully. Convoy Habitat Orisun Spine confirms population 18,603. Holding dark route position for 312 years. We have heard your signal chain. Awaiting instruction. I read it twice. Then I looked at the sender metadata, the route coordinates, the age of the transmission architecture. Old Earth-derived compression. Modified colony band security. Long-haul drift signatures so stretched by distance and improvisation that a modern assembly clerk would probably have classified the packet as noise if they hadn't known what to look for. 43 settlements. 43 answers. 43 points of proof that humanity had not vanished. It had dispersed. That mattered. Extinction is clean. Tragic sometimes but clean. It fits in a file. It allows power to grieve ceremonially and move on. Dispersal is uglier. Dispersal means responsibility stays alive. By then the Needle's Luck no longer felt like a salvage tug. She felt like an overworked embassy with bad plumbing. Every surface had become either a legal staging area, a comm station, or a place where one of us had set down a cup and forgotten it in the middle of something species-sized. Pyrie handled incoming settlement verification and continuity routing. Leo ran population matrices, survival assessments, and route overlays against assembly jurisdiction maps until his eyes went bloodshot from layered projections. Joran kept the ship alive through what he referred to as continuous acts of intimate mechanical diplomacy. And I went to hearings. A great many hearings. The first year of the continuity review was not glorious. Anyone telling you the resurrection of a civilization feels triumphant every day has never spent those days inside institutions. Mostly it felt administrative. Filing deadlines. Counter-filings. Historical claim maps. Transit rights objections. A Vath motion to limit the definition of living continuity to populations within registered core systems, which failed after the Tesh and N blocks dismantled it in public session so elegantly I nearly applauded. A RAL proposal to establish provisional standing for non-ceased but incompletely surveyed civilizations. That one passed. Barely. Which was how humanity acquired a new status in the record. Provisionally recognized continuity population. Survey in process. It was not a flag. Not a nation restored. Not soul reborn under glorious music. But it was enough to file petitions under. Enough to hold representation under. Enough to force certain doors to remain open unless someone wanted to be seen closing them with witnesses present. The first time I saw the new designation attached to a human settlement request, I stared at the line so long that the clerk processing the submission asked whether I required medical assistance. I told her no. What I required and what I got 3 weeks later was the first convoy. It came in under mixed documentation: 2 drift freighters, 1 patched colony transport, 1 survey cutter flying an improvised continuity pennant no one had officially approved and no one had the nerve to forbid. They arrived through Meridian Spoke's outer traffic lanes on a cold cycle morning when the station was busy enough that the news had to work to spread and still spread faster than sense. I was on Dock 14 before the first ship sealed. So were Pyrie, Leo and Joran. So, to my private satisfaction, was Elder Archivist Sun Var, leaning on his brace and pretending he had wandered there by accident. The first hatch opened on the transport from Keshet Line. A woman stepped through wearing shipboard gray, weathered at the knees and cuffs, silver threaded through her hair, face lined not by age alone but by 6 centuries of inherited motion. She paused on the threshold as if the station gravity itself needed to be negotiated with. Then she saw me. Not because we knew each other. Because she knew what I represented. Not authority. Not rescue. Recognition. She walked down the ramp slowly, each step measured, and stopped an arm's length away. "My name is Ruth Aram," she said. "Council Navigator, Keshet Line." "Sarah Vale," I said. "Provisional Representative, Sole Continuity Docket." Ruth's eyes flicked past me to the diplomatic crest above Dock 14. The old one. The one that had been dark for centuries until the Needle's luck docked under it and forced someone to reconnect the power. For a moment she did not speak. Then she asked very quietly, "Is that ours?" I looked up too. The crest glowed pale gold against station alloy, old lines restored by current through forgotten circuits. "Yes," I said. Ruth closed her eyes once. Only once. When she opened them again there was no dramatic collapse, no speech, no public tears. Just a woman who had spent her entire life aboard a moving world allowing herself one visible second of relief. Behind her more people emerged. Shipborne children staring openly. Transit elders walking with that careful long balance gait of people used to decks that were never still. A medic carrying sealed records in both hands as though the paperwork itself might finally be allowed to matter. They were not an army. That was the point. The assembly knew how to react to armies. It had no instinctive defense against continuity arriving in work clothes carrying census files and school records. By the end of that week, 3 more habitats had committed to sending delegates or census teams. 2 could not risk open transit yet but transmitted verified populations under Tesh archival protection. 1 dark route station asked whether they were required to use the word humanity in the forms or whether us would remain legally sufficient for now. Pyrie answered that one personally. Use whichever word your children will not have to apologize for later. That became famous in circles no official historian will ever admit mattered. The assembly adapted the way old institutions always do when they realize a temporary inconvenience has become infrastructure. New review dockets were created. Census missions were funded, reluctantly and in smaller numbers than needed. Corridor access negotiations began, each one wrapped in enough procedural language to make generosity look accidental. And the opposition adapted too. The Vath coalition did not soften. Why would they? They had belts, farms, generations of investment, and the full confidence of people who believe history belongs more to whoever used it longest than to whoever survived it first. Their briefs grew sharper. Their arguments more refined. They stopped saying humanity was gone and started saying humanity's return must be balanced against established stability, which was a more sophisticated way of protecting the same theft. Good. Sophistication is slower. Slow opposition gives you time to build. Leo understood that before I did. One night, somewhere between the 50th settlement response and the 7th revised continuity matrix, he pulled the route map up across the main bridge screen without warning. Human settlements glowed in blue. Known assembly lanes in white. Old ignored drift corridors in amber. At first it looked scattered. Then the eye adjusted. Lines emerged. Communications chains. Shared gaps. Survival clusters. Improvised economies. Regions where human populations had not simply endured but quietly learned to depend on one another without waiting for permission. "We've been reading this wrong," Leo said. "How?" "We keep talking like this is a lost civilization coming back." He pointed at the map. "It isn't. It's a civilization that never stopped moving. That was the real ending. Not the chamber. Not the ruling. Not even the registry correction. Movement. Once I saw it I couldn't unsee it. Humanity had not survived by sitting in the dark hoping to be rediscovered. It had survived by building lanes under the notice of power. By drifting, adapting, repairing, teaching, rationing, recording, and keeping just enough signal alive for someone someday to hear the answer when it came back. 3 months after the first convoy docking, I filed a new motion with the Assembly. Not for restoration. Not yet. For route recognition. For the formal charting of human continuity corridors currently absent from official maps. It caused outrage naturally, which is how I knew it mattered. That night after the filing, I took the buoy from my bunk and set it in the cockpit again. Its shell was more worn now from handling, but the power strip still glowed. Barely. Patiently. Joran glanced at it, then at me. You're sentimental. I'm comparative. With what? I looked out at Meridian Spoke's traffic lattice, at ships moving in patterns so old they mistook themselves for inevitability. With the future, I said. The buoy's message played once more through the quiet bridge. We are ready to be known. It no longer sounded lonely. Outside the station, beyond the assembly lanes and their polished assumptions, 43 known human settlements had become 51. Then 58. Then more. The file had changed. Now the map would have to.